June 5, 1947. Harvard University. A man steps up to a podium in Harvard Yard and delivers a 12-minute speech that will reshape the entire global order. His name is George C. Marshall, U.S. Secretary of State, former Army Chief of Staff, the architect of American military victory in World War II. He does not speak of armies or weapons or conquests, speaks of money. $13 billion, the equivalent of over $160 billion today, to be sent to Europe, not as loans, not as reparations, as gifts. No nation in history had ever done anything like it. And many Americans asked a simple, brutal question. Why should we pay to rebuild the countries that just spent 6 years trying to destroy each other? The answer Marshall gave would define the next 70 years of global power. This is not a story about generosity. This is a story about the most effective use of financial power in modern history. To understand what Marshall was proposing and why you need to see Europe in 1947, it was a continent in ruins. World War II had ended in May 1945. 2 years had passed, but recovery had barely begun. Cities across Europe lay in rubble: Berlin, Warsaw, Rotterdam. Entire urban centers reduced to skeletal remains. In Germany alone, it was estimated that over 400 million cubic meters of debris filled the streets. Agricultural production had collapsed. Fields were mined. Livestock slaughtered. Supply chains obliterated. Industrial capacity was shattered. Factories destroyed by bombing campaigns or stripped for reparations. Coal production in Germany, the industrial engine of Central Europe, had fallen to a fraction of pre-war levels. The winter of 1946-47 was the coldest Europe had experienced in decades. People froze in their homes because there was no coal. They starved because food distribution networks no longer functioned. The economic system was not recovering. It was dying. And here's what terrified American policymakers. The Soviet Union was watching. Joseph Stalin's armies occupied Eastern Europe. Communist parties in France, Italy, and Greece were gaining strength, not through ideology alone, but through desperation. When people are hungry, cold, and hopeless, they listen to whoever promises change. The Marshall Plan was born out of this crisis, but its origins stretched further back. American officials had studied the aftermath of World War I carefully. They remembered the Treaty of Versailles, the punishing reparations imposed on Germany that had destabilized the Weimar Republic and contributed directly to the rise of Hitler. The lesson was clear: punishing your enemies economically creates new enemies. George Marshall, Harry Truman, and their advisors believed something different. If you rebuild your enemies, if you invest in their recovery, you turn them into partners. You create dependencies. You build a system where their prosperity depends on yours. It was not charity, it was a strategy. The speech Marshall gave at Harvard in June 1947 was carefully constructed. He did not frame the proposal as an American plan for Europe. He framed it as a European plan that America would fund. The initiative, Marshall said, must come from Europe. European nations would assess their own needs, coordinate their own recovery plans, and present a unified request. America would provide the resources. It was brilliant framing. It avoided the appearance of American imperialism. It placed responsibility on European governments, and it forced Europe to work together, something that had not happened voluntarily in centuries. But not everyone was invited. The Soviet Union and its satellites in Eastern Europe were offered participation. Marshall's team knew Stalin would refuse, and he did. The Soviets viewed the Marshall Plan as a capitalist trap, an American attempt to extend economic control over Europe disguised as aid. Stalin was not entirely wrong. By July 1947, 16 Western European nations had agreed to participate. Britain, France, Italy, West Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, and others formed the Organization for European Economic Cooperation to coordinate the recovery. In April 1948, the U.S. Congress passed the Economic Cooperation Act, formally authorizing the Marshall Plan and committing 5% of America's GDP to European reconstruction over 4 years. 5% of GDP. For context, that would be equivalent to the United States spending over $1.3 trillion on foreign aid today. In a single program, for a single purpose, the scale was unprecedented, and the debate in Congress was fierce. Republican Senator Robert Taft led the opposition. He argued that America had its own problems, that spending billions abroad while American families still faced rationing at home was politically unsustainable. Others worried that Europe would simply take the money and collapse again, that no amount of aid could fix structural problems this deep. But Truman and Marshall made a different case. They argued that American prosperity depended on European recovery. If Europe collapsed into poverty and chaos, American exports would collapse with it. That communist expansion in Europe was not just a political threat, it was an economic one. And they argued, quietly but insistently, that this was America's moment to reshape the global system in its own image. The vote passed. And in April 1948, the first Marshall Plan shipments began to arrive in European ports. Grain from Kansas, machinery from Pennsylvania, cotton from the South, coal from Appalachia. The supplies were real. The impact was immediate. But the structure beneath the aid was where the real power lay. European nations receiving Marshall funds were required to agree to certain conditions. They had to reduce trade barriers between themselves. They had to stabilize their currencies. They had to cooperate on economic planning. They had to allow American oversight of how the money was spent. It was not controlled in the traditional sense. No troops, no governors, no colonial administrators. But it was influenced at a depth that no empire had ever achieved through conquest alone. And the Europeans, desperate and pragmatic, accepted. By the end of 1948, industrial production in Marshall Plan countries was rising faster than anyone had predicted. Food supplies stabilized, coal production increased, factories reopened, unemployment began to fall. The program was working, but working for whom? American companies were exporting more to Europe than ever before. European economies were being rebuilt in ways that favored American trade relationships. Political parties that opposed American influence were losing ground, not through force, but through irrelevance. The Marshall Plan was reconstructing Europe, but it was also constructing something else entirely: system. A system where American money, American companies, and American strategic interests were woven so deeply into European recovery that pulling them apart would mean collapse. And that system, built in the rubble of World War II, was about to become the foundation of a new kind of empire. One built not on soldiers, but on loans, trade agreements, and the silent dependencies of financial power. The money kept flowing. Between 1948 and 1951, the Marshall Plan distributed over $13 billion across Western Europe, the equivalent of roughly 1.3% of America's total GDP over that period, delivered in the form of grants, not loans. On paper, it was the most generous act of international aid in history. But generosity is complicated when the giver writes the rules. The European Recovery Program, the Marshall Plan's formal name, came with conditions that went far beyond simple reconstruction. These conditions were not hidden. They were written into the agreements that every participating nation signed. First, European countries had to liberalize trade. Tariffs between Marshall Plan nations had to be reduced or eliminated. Internal markets had to open. Second, currencies had to stabilize. Governments could not simply print money to pay debts. Fiscal discipline was required. Third, American consultants and advisors were given access to European economic planning. They reviewed budgets, assessed infrastructure projects, and made recommendations that carried the weight of continued funding behind them. Fourth, and this is where the strategic depth becomes visible, American companies were given priority access to European markets. When France needed machinery, the Marshall Plan funds were tied to purchases from American manufacturers. When Italy needed grain, it came from American farms. When Germany rebuilt its rail system, the steel came through American-approved supply chains. The Europeans were not stupid. They understood what was happening. French economist Jean Monnet, one of the architects of European integration, described it clearly. We are accepting American aid not because we are weak, but because refusing it would make us weaker. That sentence contains everything you need to understand about how financial power works. By 1949, the Marshall Plan's effects were undeniable. Industrial production in participating countries had risen by 35% above pre-war levels. Agricultural output was recovering, unemployment was falling. The communist parties in France and Italy, which had seemed poised to take power in 1947, were now losing ground in elections. The strategy was working exactly as intended, but beneath the success, tensions were building. European nations were growing increasingly aware that their recovery was creating long-term dependencies. American companies now held significant market share in critical European industries. American banks held influence over European credit markets. American advisors sat in government ministries across the continent. In Britain, some politicians began referring to the Marshall Plan as dollar imperialism. The phrase did not catch on publicly. Britain needed the money too much, but the resentment was real. In France, Charles de Gaulle, who had resigned as leader in 1946 but remained a powerful voice, warned that France was trading political sovereignty for economic recovery. He was right. But most French citizens, emerging from hunger and rubble into relative stability, did not care. And that is how financial power solidifies. Not through force, through necessity. When survival depends on someone else's money, challenging them becomes unthinkable. The Korean War began on June 25, 1950. It was a regional conflict on the Korean Peninsula, but its impact on the Marshall Plan was immediate and transformative. America's attention and its money shifted toward rearmament. The Truman administration announced that Marshall Plan aid would be increasingly tied to military rebuilding. Europe was no longer just being reconstructed economically. It was being integrated into a military alliance against the Soviet Union. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, had been formed in April 1949. Now it was being armed, trained and funded as part of the broader Marshall Framework. European nations that had accepted economic aid were now being asked to accept American military bases, to contribute troops to a collective defense structure, and to align their foreign policies with Washington. The bargain was clear: accept American military leadership or risk losing the economic support that had made recovery possible. Most accepted. West Germany was the test case. In 1949, the Federal Republic of Germany was officially established. Under the Marshall Plan, West Germany received more aid than any other European nation, roughly $1.4 billion. But the aid came with conditions that went beyond economics. West Germany was prohibited from rebuilding an independent military. Its industrial capacity was carefully monitored to prevent rearmament. Its currency, the Deutschmark, introduced in 1948, was stabilized under American oversight. And its political orientation was guided, carefully but firmly, toward integration with the Western Bloc. By 1951, West Germany was the fastest-growing economy in Europe. The German economic miracle was underway. But it was a miracle built on American capital and American rules. The Marshall Plan ended officially in December 1951. Over 4 years, it had distributed $13.3 billion. It had rebuilt factories, restored agriculture, stabilized currencies, and created an economic system that tied European prosperity to American interests. But the structures it created did not end. What replaced the Marshall Plan was something more permanent. The Organization for European Economic Cooperation, created to coordinate Marshall Plan distribution, evolved into the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development in 1961, a permanent institution linking American and European economic policy. NATO, which had started as a defensive alliance, became the military framework for American influence in Europe. The Bretton Woods system, established in 1944 to stabilize international currency, gave the U.S. dollar a privileged position as the world's reserve currency, a position that Marshall Plan policies had reinforced by making European economies dependent on dollar-based trade. And American companies, which had gained market access during the Reconstruction, remained embedded in European economies for decades. The Marshall Plan had ended, but the system it created was just beginning. There was no collapse. That is the most important thing to understand about the Marshall Plan. It did not fail. It did not overreach. It did not trigger resentment strong enough to undo it. It succeeded so completely that its framework became invisible. By the 1960s, European economies were booming. The German Wirtschaftswunder, economic miracle, was the most visible symbol, but growth was continent-wide. France rebuilt under Dirige's planning. Italy industrialized its north. Britain, despite losing its empire, remained a major economy. And all of it was tied structurally and financially to the United States. The dollar remained the anchor of international trade. American corporations held major positions in European markets. NATO provided the security umbrella. The OECD coordinated economic policy. The International Monetary Fund and World Bank, both dominated by American voting power, managed global financial stability. This was not an empire in the old sense. There were no governors, no colonial administrations, no direct taxation. But influence is not measured by flags. It is measured by dependencies. And the dependencies the Marshall Plan created were total. The immediate consequences were economic and political. Economically, the Marshall Plan locked Europe into the American-led international trade system. The General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, GATT, established in 1947, became the framework for global trade liberalization. European nations that had protected their markets for centuries opened them under American pressure and financial incentive. American exports to Europe increased by over 300% between 1947 and 1952. American companies, IBM, Ford, Coca-Cola, General Electric, established European subsidiaries that became dominant players in their sectors. The dollar's role as reserve currency meant that global trade increasingly ran through American financial institutions. Even transactions between European countries were often settled in dollars. Politically, the Marshall Plan created a Western bloc that was economically and militarily integrated under American leadership. The Soviet attempt to create a rival system in Eastern Europe through the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, or Comecon, never achieved the same level of coordination or prosperity. The division of Europe into East and West was not just ideological, it was economic. And the economic model that won the Marshall Plan model was one where prosperity came through integration with American power. The Marshall Plan's long-term legacy is visible in almost every institution of the modern global order. The European Union, which began as the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, was directly encouraged by Marshall Plan policies that required European nations to coordinate economically. Jean Monnet, one of the EU's founding architects, explicitly framed European integration as a way to manage American influence while preserving European sovereignty. It was a compromise. Europe would unite to balance American power. But that unity was built on a foundation of American-designed institutions. The Bretton Woods system collapsed in 1971 when Nixon ended dollar-gold convertibility. But the dollar's dominance did not end. If anything, it deepened, because the global trading system built during the Marshall Plan era had made the dollar indispensable. The World Trade Organization's successor to GATT operates on principles that were pioneered in the Marshall Plan: trade liberalization, market integration, dispute resolution through international institutions rather than military force. Even China's rise in the global economy followed a path that was shaped by Marshall Plan logic. When China opened its economy in the 1980s, it did so by integrating into a global trading system that America had designed and dominated since the 1940s. The Marshall Plan did not just rebuild Europe. It built the template for how economic power operates in the modern world. The Marshall Plan is often taught as an act of American generosity, and in one sense, it was. $13 billion, an extraordinary sum, was given, not loaned, to rebuild former enemies. But generosity and strategy are not opposites. The Marshall Plan was both. It was generous in the sense that it saved millions of lives, rebuilt shattered economies, and prevented the collapse of European civilization into chaos and extremism. It was strategic in the sense that it locked those economies into a system where American influence was permanent. American companies were embedded, and American financial institutions held structural power. George Marshall understood something that most people miss. You do not control other countries by conquering them. You control them by making their prosperity depend on you. The British Empire ruled through soldiers and governors. It lasted centuries but collapsed in decades. The American system built through the Marshall Plan rules through loans, trade agreements, and financial institutions. It has lasted over 70 years and shows no sign of ending. Because when power is invisible, it is almost impossible to resist. The Marshall Plan taught the world a lesson that every rising power since has tried to copy. China's Belt and Road Initiative is an attempt to replicate the Marshall Plan's logic: use, infrastructure investment, to create dependencies and extend influence. The European Union's expansion into Eastern Europe followed the same model offer: economic integration and financial support in exchange for political alignment. Even the IMF and World Bank operate on Marshall Plan principles, provide aid in crisis, but attach conditions that reshape economies in ways that favor the lender. The question is not whether the Marshall Plan was generous or manipulative. It was both. Always, the question is whether any other approach would have worked. And history suggests, probably not. Financial power, used well, is the most effective and least destructive form of control ever invented. The Marshall Plan proved it. And the world we live in today is still living inside the system it built. If this documentary changed the way you think about foreign aid, economic power, and the hidden structures of global influence, please like this video and subscribe. Subscribe for more deep financial history documentaries. The past is not behind us. It is the foundation we stand on.